So we're going to talk now about classification. And I've mentioned this before, but biologists and scientists, we love to define, we love to classify, we love to make little hierarchies and guidelines that help us understand living things. And that's really what classification is about. So there's a whole field called taxonomy devoted to grouping species based on their relationships, based on their common ancestry. And so from this field of taxonomy, organisms will be divided up into various groups. And some of these you've probably heard of: kingdoms, families, genus is one most people have heard of. And so these groupings group organisms based on their ancestral or evolutionary relationships. At the very top of these groupings, all living things are classified into just 3 domains. So every single living thing on Earth has to fit into one of these 3 domains. The first is bacteria. So domain bacteria is organisms that are unicellular, that means single-celled, and prokaryotic. Prokaryotic means that they do not have what's called a true nucleus. And we'll talk more about what a true nucleus is in chapter 4, but just sort of keep this in your mind for right now. And then the second domain is Archaea, domain Archaea. So domain Archaea is also unicellular, single-celled, and also prokaryotic, also do not have a nucleus. So you might be wondering to yourself, well, why the heck are they in 2 different domains if their description is exactly the same? And so I'll just remind you that taxonomy is about common ancestral relationships. And so bacteria and archaea, even though to our eyes they look really similar, in reality, if you look at them genetically, you look at their genetic material, look at other molecules in them, they are not close relatives. And in fact, archaea are organisms that are more closely related to us, which is very strange. And, you know, I'll mention this later, this was not something that scientists always understood. And in fact, when I took biology in college, we lumped bacteria and archaea together because we didn't know that they weren't closely related yet. Okay, so those are the 2 prokaryotic domains. The domain that we're going to spend the most time talking about this semester is domain Eukarya. And this is the domain that you're most familiar with because it, of course, includes us. So domain Eukarya can be organisms that are either unicellular, so single-celled. So an example of this would be yeast cells, for example. So like the yeast that we use to make bread is a unicellular eukaryote. But they are also multicellular eukaryotes. And of course, like I said, this is the ones we're most familiar with. Eukaryotes means to have a true nucleus. So prokaryotic is the opposite of eukaryotic. Prokaryotic, no nucleus. Eukaryotic, yes, nucleus. So Eukarya, domain Eukarya includes animals like ourselves, plants, fungi, so mushrooms and yeasts and molds are all examples of fungi. And then another sort of loose group called protists that you'll see more in the lab than in class, but a group of unicellular eukaryotes that live in pond water. So here's, again, just going over these 3 domains again. Domain bacteria and domain archaea are these unicellular prokaryotes. They're also tiny, tiny, tiny. So in this picture, you don't really get that because they've magnified this a lot. But prokaryotic cells, bacteria and archaea, are much, 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 much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And again, later in the semester, you'll get a sense for this in the lab when you're going to look at these guys in the microscope yourself. These are all examples of eukaryotes. So, of course, animals, plants, fungi, and these are those protists that I was referring to, which are also small, but not as small as bacteria. So as I mentioned earlier, there are other groupings that organisms are grouped into. So domain is at the very top. So this is domain Eukarya, for example, in this image. And then organisms are classified into increasingly small groups. So in this case, we're following the panther here, which is in kingdom Animalia. It's in phylum Chordata, that's having a backbone. It's in class Mammalia, so being a mammal. Order Carnivora, you probably know that means meat eater. Family Felidae, that means cats, so this includes large cats and small cats. Genus Panthera is only the large cats. And finally, the last category is a species, which gets you to an individual organism.